couple of years ago, I was able to sit down with my friend Tom Durkin, who still works with the Center for Peacemaking, but he's also the education program director of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. And so he's kind enough to join us today. With him is his colleague, Cindy Loertsher, who's the Director of Research for Hostage Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Foundation. And so I want to cover a couple of things today. First of all, Tom, thank you for joining us. Of course, Cindy as well. But Tom, let me start with you. Hopefully, as a Marquette alum, our university alums know well about the Foley Foundation and its mission and vision. But can you bring us up to speed on the organization and some of the things it's working on? And then I want to go to Cindy on a very important, compelling recent report that the foundation issued that she edited and authored, and want to get her take on that. But give us a sense of the foundation and some of the things that you're working on.
Of course, and well, thank you for having us. It's nice to talk with you again. It has been a few years, so I'm happy to tell you where the foundation is. And at the highest level, our mission has not changed. Our mission is to free Americans who are held captive and prevent unjust detainment for not just travelers, but for Americans living abroad. One of the ways that our mission has slightly changed is when we first started after Jim's murder, we were very focused on journalists. And of course, we have a journalist safety program that we try to provide skills and preventive techniques for journalists working abroad. But our mission really is now focused on all Americans. We found that it's not just journalists who are at risk of being captured or being held. So we're focused on aid workers. We're focused on executives who are working overseas and living overseas. And so it's allowed us to be more broad scoped. And that's something you'll see later when you're talking to Cindy about the reports we're doing and what we're finding about hostage taking, and even how that ecosystem has developed over time and how we try to stay in front of that, whether we're talking about hostages or wrongful detainees, again, which Cindy will get into. But one of the things that we've really focused on is we were really focused on conflict journalists. And one of the things we realized is that it's not just journalists working in conflict zones that are at risk or are concerned about their safety. It starts domestically. And we feel like those skills are transferable, that if journalists working at home start learning preventive skills, especially at the undergraduate level, those skills can translate when they start working overseas, if they decide to go into conflict zones. And so our vision would be, it's a world where Americans abroad are no longer at risk of being taken hostage. Clearly, we're not there. So what we need to do is we need to provide American citizens with the skills and the training and the awareness of what can happen abroad and how they can protect themselves. So we've really evolved over time with as we've come to understand the larger scope of the problem.
What are some of the things that the foundation does? We'll talk toward the end. Is obviously a big event, commemorate or to acknowledge Jim in terms of a virtual race, and that's a fundraiser. But throughout the year, what are some of the other things? Again, we'll talk to Cindy in a minute about the report, but what are some of the other both events and things that the Foley Foundation is involved in?
Well, some of the things that we do is that we've created a curriculum and we work directly with universities in terms of implementing safety throughout a curriculum for young journalists. And so what that means is we're not trying to create a safety course. What we're trying to do is to have journalists realize that safety is not an add-on. To be an effective journalist, you need to be a safe journalist. So one element is working directly with colleges and universities. Another thing we've done is we partnered with this group called Headset. And Headset is based in the UK. And what they provide is virtual reality training for journalists. So you get put into situations, like it might be like a protest situation, and you start to realize what the experience is before you're actually in that realm. So the idea is that we can provide this to freelancers who might not have the financial capabilities to take perhaps a HEFAT training, which is a hostile environment in first aid. They might not have the ability to travel to take these courses. So we're able to deliver the virtual reality equipment and some of the foundation of the curriculum to them so that they can get this type of training. The other thing that, the most recent thing we did is we created a traveler safety guide with Doug Pattison, who is a former member of the Foley board and former CIA member, who created this travel safety guide for all Americans, anyone who's traveling abroad, in terms of things that they should be aware of. And it's a slim guide, but it's packed with useful information, and all of the materials that we create are available free of charge on our website that anyone can access. We've talked to a number of organizations that are interested in this, and we just want to make sure that people have the tools and the resources to protect themselves. So we try to look at it from many different angles.
Well, that's great. I've actually seen that. I have a copy of that report, and you're right. It's short, but it's very succinct, and I think that's so important. And you obviously, as you said, you make that free of charge. And we know obviously the danger that journalists are in internationally, but sadly also domestically with attacks on the media. Let me shift gears. Cindy, I reached out to Tom and you in part because besides what Tom just described, I saw the Bringing Americans Home 2023 report, your fifth report that you put together. And a couple things I obviously want to hear directly, the recommendations that you have in the report, but can you describe, besides what Tom's already said, the increasing threats of Americans abroad, and you do list in the report some of the more dangerous countries. Obviously there's danger regardless of where, so you have to be careful no matter where you're traveling, but you obviously focus on that. And then just a sense of what you hope to accomplish with the report. Again, it's the fifth annual report. There's a lot of really good information in there. Talk a bit about what goes into putting it together and some of the highlights.
Well, sure. John, thanks again for having us. It's a privilege to be here. As you said, this is our fifth consecutive Bringing Americans Home report. It's been, the purpose of these reports is to engage with a lot of the families, right? We specifically work with hostage families and wrongful detainee families. And I think what's important, let me just pause, what's important for the audience is what's the difference between a hostage case and a wrongful detention case, right? So the hostage situation, you can have different types of hostage situations, but the Foley Foundation, we focus on cases very similar to Jim's, where an individual is kidnapped either by a terrorist organization, a militant group, pirates, or even criminal actors. However, when we collect these cases, we do exclude criminal cases. Specifically, we want to make sure we have the most representative database and sample to be able to acknowledge or to be able to observe trends in the current landscape of these types of cases. So over the years, we've collected this information, and when we work with wrongful detainees, those are individuals that are held by state actors, right? So these are foreign governments that are holding these Americans hostage, essentially. There's a lot of similarities between these cases. For example, hostage cases and wrongful detentions, they're held because they have a blue passport. They're Americans. These terrorist organizations or a foreign government wants to effect change in U.S. policy, force some form of concessions or a prisoner exchange, and because of that, the result of how we handle these cases, it varies greatly, which kind of gets into why we define these cases as wrongful detainees and hostage cases, where hostages we can usually have like a counterterrorism response versus a wrongful detention. We need to rely more on our diplomatic engagement. So our responses yield a different response from the U.S. government. So these cases kind of get separated. However, at the same time, we have to remember that they're held for those purposes. So, we've been examining these. We've conducted over 250 interviews mostly with hostage families former hostages and wrongful detainees themselves. But we don't ignore, we also focus on U.S. officials, current or former U.S. officials, so we can get a full picture. And we're looking at what we call the U.S. hostage enterprise. And that's, and that is how, those are the structures that have been put into place within our government and how we handle these cases. We have a hostage recovery fusion cell that's housed within the FBI. It's an interagency that's housed in the FBI, so it's a little separate. We also, within our State Department, we have our Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. We call them the SPHA. And within the White House National Security Council specifically, we have a hostage response group. So those are the structures that are put into place. And so when we conduct these reports, we're working with these families and understanding the challenges that they have when they're navigating this U.S. hostage enterprise. And so, and one of the outcomes of that are recommendations and findings. And a lot of those recommendations are that they focus on policymakers, the legislators, as well as, officials working within that hostage enterprise. So we make those recommendations to make these little tweaks here and there. And those are all derived from family experiences and their perspective. So they're very close to home. And these issues, as I'll get into here in a second, they evolve very quickly. At a certain time, we had more Americans held hostage. Now we're seeing, more Americans being wrongfully detained. So, for the purpose of the report, just generally some of the things we found, that the majority, so we have, there's been a shift, as I was just saying, in wrongful detentions. And to put it into perspective, we're in the middle of seeing historic levels of U.S. nationals wrongfully detained by foreign governments. And over the past decade, this had, our data begins in 2001. So in the past decade, we've seen a 175% increase in the number of wrongful detention incidents. And in addition to the incidents, there's been a 580% increase of the number of U.S. nationals who continue to be held year after year. So we have a fairly steady increase of incidents, but at the same time, more and more Americans are continuing to be held. And it's a cumulative growth. It's not an exponential growth, meaning we have 2 to 4 or 5 Americans that continue to be held each year. But however, in this our most recent report, we have seen a significant decrease. And I had to update the data, which is great and always great news since we published the report a couple of weeks ago. Or was it last week? Just shortly. But now we've had 30 releases of U.S. nationals wrongfully detained since 2022. And really, 2022 contained the highest number of wrongful detainee releases overall within our database since 2001.
What do you attribute? I'm sorry to interrupt, but what do you attribute that to? The increase? Is it more support? I mean, you've already outlined from the White House to policymakers. There's obviously more State Department. There's National Security Council. There's more involvement, it seems, from the outside looking in. From my perspective, not knowing any of this, the specifics. But what do you attribute that to? Just more focus, just high level. Obviously, some of this stuff has to be, I would say secretive, but obviously you're not announcing your strategies or anything as you're working with the families. But what do you attribute that to? Because that is obviously an interesting change.
Right. It's an excellent question, right? So, the challenge to be, it's very difficult to give a straight answer across the board what this comes down to. But maybe I can kind of lean towards that. But it's important to note that each of these cases are highly unique. Every single one is very, very unique. And it matters which country that these individuals are held in, right? So we have to first, before we can answer that question, we need to look at the geopolitical reasoning behind things. What's going on in that country? What's our foreign policy with that country? What is our relationship? So understanding that in itself is how you can start to look at some of these answers to answer that question. But to answer your question, it's difficult because each country may be holding a U.S. national for a specific reason, right? So if we look at the majority of countries that are wrongfully detaining Americans, this is Venezuela, China, Russia, We still have Americans that are, held in other countries as well, Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. But looking at our foreign policy with those countries, that'll start to unlock the key of how we can start releasing these Americans. But overall, with those structures that were put into place in June of 2015, they're starting to mature. The relationship, the position, the individuals that are holding those positions are deepening their relationships, and those departments are maturing within the State Department, within the FBI. So, and the whole purpose of those offices are to engage with the families, but also come up with recommendations to bring those recommendations up to the president's office. So, because a lot of these are difficult decisions to make, and they do end up being a decision of the president to be able to go through. So we are, we're hopeful that the structures that have been put into place and the U.S. officials that are leading those positions are deepening those relationships, and they're maturing, and we're able to get more Americans home.
That's great, and a lot of it is attributable to the good work that you folks are doing, obviously. What other recommendations do you have in the report? I mean, it's like you say, it's pretty clear. The infrastructure's improved. Working closely with the families is so important. And as you say, a lot of this depends on the jurisdiction where there's the wrongful detention. What is our relationship there? And you've identified some countries where things are more problematic. What are some of the other recommendations in the report that people should be aware of?
Right. Like I said before, we're still seeing historic levels of Americans who continue to be held. And when you look at that data and you see it's a cumulative growth, like let's say in the previous decade, the majority of Americans were released within a year. Now, in this past decade, it has completely flipped. The majority of Americans have been held for over 4 years. And of our 55 cases, there's 6 of those cases where those Americans have been held for over 10 years, and the average is 14. So while we're still getting Americans out, we still have these cases, and again, they're country dependent. Roughly half of the U.S. nationals who are currently being held now are in Venezuela, China, and Russia. And so, how we can look at those cases and be able to continue to work on those relationships are really what the challenge is, and where the focus needs to be. But when we look at this entirely, if we look at the hostage and wrongful detainee landscape entirely, we go back to our policy. And our policy, their current policy is from 2015, which is Presidential Policy Directive 30. We call it PBD 30. Parts of that was later codified in the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act in 2020. But the thing is, what PPD 30 did was focus on hostage cases. We didn't really look at wrongful detentions. And again, this comes back to how we respond. As I mentioned earlier, we can have a counterterrorism response for hostage taking. Most often, we cannot have that with, foreign governments, right? Like that causes more conflict. And we rely on our diplomatic engagements. So what that policy didn't really focus on was these wrongful detentions. So when we're looking at this data, and you look at the data and you see this increase of the number of Americans who continue to be held year after year, it's saying that we're missing an element. Like, we need a deterrent strategy. And these are different. Remember, you just can't have a blanket deterrent strategy across the board, because our relationships with these individual countries are very different, right? And there's second, third, fourth, 10th order effects when you try to implement a specific strategy. But what we're seeing, there's not enough data, there's not enough research on deterrence, and that's really where the heart is with, I think, what's going on today. That's most current with wrongful detentions. And one of our biggest recommendations that we have is to conduct another comprehensive review. As I mentioned, 2015, we focused on hostage cases. We haven't really done that with wrongful detentions. And we need a whole, do the current structures that we have in place, yes, they're effective, yes, they're working, but can we still continue to improve upon them? And of course, there's always room. So we want to do a periodic review every 5 years to make sure that we're handling these cases, because over 90% again are wrongful detentions versus hostage cases. And, with that, we also recommend, we need funding. So this FEHA's office does not have, as well as the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, they do not have direct lines of funding. So while there is current legislation in process for travel for families, but we really need to make sure that the FEHA's office and the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, they have the funding they need for recovery. We don't want, the last thing anybody wants to do is charge a family to recover their loved one. There's just, so, and I should say, in fairness, the FEHA's office does not, works overtime to make sure that doesn't happen. However, they don't have the right resources they need, so that's not an issue. So they've worked overtime and double time to make sure that that doesn't happen to a family member, which is remarkable. So yes.
That's great. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes. Tom, I want to come, last time we talked a few years ago, I think it was actually pre-pandemic, we were able to talk a bit about Jim Foley's legacy. You were his roommate at Marquette, his friend. Tell folks a little bit about Jim, because I think it's always important. Obviously, Diane has been phenomenal, the whole Foley family, phenomenal in putting this foundation together and all the work it's been doing over time. But for those that may not remember, Jim was a photojournalist. As we said, he was assassinated by ISIS in 2014, I believe. Tell a little bit about Jim and what people should remember about him and his legacy, besides the obvious. The foundation is a tremendous legacy, of course, but if you wouldn't mind spending a couple of minutes talking about your good friend.
Oh, thank you for that. And it couldn't come at a better time. I just left a conversation with Dan Hanrahan, who is a close friend of Jim and mine from our undergraduate days, and Rana Altenberg, who works here at Marquette and is also on the Foley board. And we were talking about, we're actually archiving Jim's work here at Marquette. And the goal is to have it, at least the beginning of it open for his the 10-year anniversary of Jim's murder. Jim was a great guy. Met him as a freshman at Marquette. He was a really interesting guy. I thought he was backwoods. He was from New Hampshire, and I'm from Chicago, and we were living in Milwaukee, and he was just a really curious person who was willing to try new things and always had an ear out for stories and he was a really good listener, and that's what made him a great journalist. He could listen to people without inserting himself into the story. And he didn't start off as a journalist. I mean, he was a fiction writer, he was a teacher, he did a number of things before he found his passion to be a journalist. But once he found his passion, his goal in life was to uncover stories, to reveal truths to people, to go places that might have been underreported and share that. And a lot of people that criticize Jim and people like Jim for being in dangerous areas, I don't think they recognize how much more dangerous the world would be if people like Jim weren't brave enough to tell us what's taking place in those countries. Obviously, myself and like I was just mentioning Dan Hanner, and we used to have serious arguments with Jim about going into Libya, going into Syria, and like, why would you do that? Why would you put yourself in danger? But he believed in it, and it's hard. It's hard to acknowledge that you lost a friend, and you might say why were you there? When at the same time you are it's such an admirable quality to be willing to risk your own safety for the purpose of telling other people's stories. And so I think the thing that I just want Jim to be remembered as, especially as we get further and further away from when this happened, and I don't want his memory to fade, but I would like people to remember that he did it with the best intentions, and he's not alone. Like Steven Sotloff, as a journalist, Kayla Mueller, Peter Kasich, people who are working as aid workers, they're out there risking their safety and, in a sense, their family's safety, because those are the people most affected, to help bring positive change and to make sure that we understand what's going on in this world. I I don't think people recognize how much more dangerous this world could be if we don't have people telling us and sharing what is actually taking place in other places of the world where we're not willing to go.
Thanks. I'll come back to you to close this out to tell us about October 14th. But Cindy, I wanted to ask you, in terms of all the issues you're working on, has it been generally bipartisan in terms of support for the goals? Because obviously we live in such divided times, but I'm not, not asking for particular members of, House or Senate or whatever, but in general, or is it bipartisan in trying to improve the way both hostage taking and unlawful detentions are being handled? Well, what's your take, high level?
From personal experience, I can answer that question. It's a great question, and it is a bipartisan issue, and it is rare. I can't think of a time when we've gone across both aisles to talk about these issues, and we have full support. And really, it's a great question, because Congress can be an amazing tool also for hostages and their families. It's a great, for families to engage with their members of Congress. I think some of our biggest challenges is to, with all the incoming, new members, when they come and new staffers, is to educate on this issue. And it's such an important issue. And, we're always looking for, champions for hostages and wrongful detainees. And to be honest, it's not hard to find. However, we would like to do more on the Hill to educate staffers, because the Hill is a huge tool for families, because to be able to come behind their constituent, and I hate to say that as their constituent, because really the relationships that these members have with the individuals that they represent they're more like family members. And it's great to see, but we would like to see more of that, and they can champion for them to help prioritize their cases within the executive branch, which these are national security issues. Like, this impacts our economy, it impacts our national security and our foreign policy. These are individual cases. This is it's hard to get a big splash. So members of Congress can do a lot for family members to help prioritize and elevate their case to the President of the United States.
That's great. I saw that several weeks ago, Bill Richardson passed away, and one of the things he was noted for is working to bring Americans home. Did the Foley Foundation have any interaction with Richardson through his time? I know he did it for many years.
I'm sorry, John. I think the internet froze a minute. Can you ask that question?
I'm sorry. Apologize. No, that's okay. Just wondered, Bill Richardson passed a few weeks ago, and he did a lot of work in this space as well. Did you folks work with him at all? Right. So the Richardson Center was, a huge champion and very impactful champion for many families, and helpful to get a lot of, some of these releases. Danny Fenster was the case. And the Richardson team, Mickey Bergman, so they're more, they're tremendous. So we all work very nicely together. Mickey's a huge champion as well for a lot of these individuals and their families who are held overseas. Right. Tom, I'll end on this. There's a big event coming up October 14th. Besides having folks go to the website and learn how they can participate for that event and donate as well. But tell us a bit about the October 14th. I think I'm right. That's the Saturday. Tell us about that event, because it's been an annual event for a number of years, and how folks can participate.
Yeah, I definitely like that. Can I add one other thing? This is a really complex issue, and one of the things that I'm sure Cindy would acknowledge as well. We just had 5 Americans come home from Iran, and one of the criticisms or complaints is whether or not we should ransom or unfreeze their assets, and that's a big sticking point for a lot of people. And I would strongly recommend for people that are interested in this topic and maybe learning more, there is a book by Joel Simon, a former director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and it was called "We Want to Negotiate, The Secret World of Kidnapping, Hostages, and Ransom. There it is.
That was not planned. I just couldn't have it.
It's 190 pages. It's very readable, but it's about the fact that there is no evidence to indicate that paying ransom increases the amount of kidnappings and wrongful detention. There is no evidence to suggest that. It might seem counterintuitive. It might seem like, all right, you pay ransom, they're going to take more because they'll get more money. That's not usually what is the motivation behind that. And I would strongly recommend anyone interested in the topic just to get a different viewpoint to check out this book. It's a worthwhile read, and it brings you more into the hostage ecosystem and understanding the complexities involved. Maybe Joel Simon will be grateful for that plug that somehow worked out perfectly. But and we did not discuss that. But I do think for people that are interested, it's a very readable book, and it gives you a different perspective to maybe think about. But another way you can support things like the Foley organization and what we're trying to do is we have a Foley Freedom Run Walk. It takes place in New Hampshire and Washington, D.C. It also takes place virtually around the world. You can run anywhere. And if you go to foleyrun.org, you can find out more information about the run. It's a great way to support the work that the Foley Foundation is doing in terms of bringing Americans home, and also to protect journalists. And I don't know if people realize, even domestically, how important journalism is to your awareness of what's taking place here and abroad. So it's an easy way. You do not have to run the Foley Run. It's a run walk. It can be a 5K, it can be a 1K, it can be a 1 block. The idea is to support and show that you care about this issue, and you'd like to see Americans come home.
That's great. That's great. And my family has participated for a number of years, and it's fun. We did it once in Washington with other folks, and a lot of times virtual, just because that's where you are that particular day. But thanks for that, Tom. Tom and Cindy, thank you so much for your time today. More importantly, for what you both are doing, what the foundation is doing. I know this will get some folks that perhaps were on the sidelines to get engaged. And, I think the report's valuable. Obviously, some of the other things that you're working on, equally important to understand this space. It's good to know that this is a bipartisan issue from a policy standpoint. And so, again, I can't thank you enough. So both of you, stay safe. We'll talk soon, but thanks for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Great.